On this episode of Skeptiko,
we decided to just, in a moment in time, grab, screenshot all of top 1,000 people who have Twitter follower numbers. People like Justin Bieber had the most Twitter followers. Oprah Winfrey was in there. Dalai Lama was in there. And then looked for the charts.
So the chance of the celebrities having that alignment of those planets is over 90%. Over 90% of them are in that range. And then of the control group, it's 45%. And then you ran all these trials, and when you run that through statistical analysis, the odds of that just being chance is far less than 1 out of 100, right?
That's a good summary. So that was step one. And then step two in that paper was to show a correlation.
So of your list of 86, those are spread across that 1,000 ranking. So you might have somebody, they might be down in the 1,000 range, like you just said. And then the real stunner, what you said is, any one of that 86 who happen to rank in the top 100, 100% correlation between that and having this certain position of the planet kind of thing.
That's absolutely right. That's what we found.
Wow, that is pretty incredible.
stay with us for Skeptiko.
Welcome to Skeptiko, where we explore controversial science and spirituality with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. I'm your host, Alex Sakaris, and this introduction is going to be a little bit of a long one, because this story today is a long one, interesting one. It's about astrology. It starts with me getting an email, the kind of emails I love to get from a Skeptiko listener who's well-informed, is science-oriented, and is digging for more. The email's from a guy named Jonathan, and he writes, "Dear Alex, I write you as a huge fan of your show. Out of all your guests, it is Dr. Julie Beischel and her rigorous methodology that has impressed me the most. She clearly has a love of science and uses the scientific method to discover knowledge once thought undiscoverable. In that vein, I wanted to introduce you to the work of Renay Oshop. She's using her genius-level mind and mathematical skills to investigate astrology and getting results like Dr. Beischel's." Now, Jonathan goes on, but you get the gist of the email. Catches my attention. I love Julie's work, exactly as he said, using scientific methods to unmask bullshit scientific paradigms. He doesn't say that, I do. And give us a better sense of what's really going on in these kind of fringe areas that we think may be somewhat true, but we can't really put our hands on. Astrology, hey, great. Fits into that category. We all know it's bullshit, right? Well, we all kind of think it's bullshit, but we kind of think maybe there's something to it. We know the ancient Chinese were into astrology, and we have Vedic astrology from India. And then, of course, we have ancient Egypt and Babylon and a lot of history that somehow rolls into the astrology that we see today and gives us this sense that while this daily reading stuff that we read might not be true, I think a lot of us have a sense that maybe there's something there that all these great traditions for thousands of years knew about. Now, of course, what also makes this so interesting to me is that when you turn to science and say, hey, from an observational standpoint, we have a question, is there anything going on here? What you get is classic scientism. Opinionated dogma. I wouldn't believe it even if it was true. As an example, after doing this whole show, I was listening to Joe Rogan, who, of course, everybody knows and does this excellent podcast, even though he sometimes can't get past this kind of inbred skepticism that he has. But anyways, he's got Neil deGrasse Tyson on the show, one of the most famous atheist scientists of our time, who everyone thinks is so smart. I don't get it. I don't think the guy is that smart. I mean, I've interviewed dozens and dozens of people on Skeptiko that I tell you, just from an intellectual horsepower, able to handle issues, seem a hell of a lot smarter than this guy. But hey, everyone's romanced with Neil deGrasse Tyson. He's a great presenter. So anyways, they're talking about astrology. Here's what they say.
Then you go to the astrologers' tables, and they say, oh, this is the rain sign, or this is a drought sign. And they take the names of things, and those names are what they interpret based on where the moon is, the sun is, where the planets are, and all whatever the angle configurations there are. And each angle has a certain latitude over which they'll count it as a hit rather than as a miss. And so this gives extraordinary capacity of the astrologer to tell you what's going on in your life.
So it's bullshit.
So classic Neil deGrasse Tyson, he's mixing in some stuff that's probably true, factual, with just some bullshit crap that he's never investigated. Here to me is the scientific question about astrology. Is there a correlation between the positioning of these planets and events that are happening down here in the physical world? That's it. Because look, when science enters into a fringe area, it has to work from the ground up, right? It has to work from observation to correlation to causation. I mean, it'd be great if you could start with causation and say, hey, we found these two things cause each other. Now let's go out in the real world and find out all that stuff that happens. But that's not usually the case. Take, for example, our buddy Rupert Sheldrake, right? Cambridge biologist, does all this fringe stuff, dogs that know when their owners are coming home. But he also does this great thing with the staring thing, right? So this is that we have the sense that we're being stared at, and he wanted to look at that. So you start with the observation. The observation here, in that case, on the staring phenomenon, is that we have overwhelming anecdotal data. If you go to people who do professional surveillance, they say, hey, if you're following somebody, don't stare them in the back of the head. They're liable to turn around. If you go to spies, if you go to undercover detectives, it's part of their training. They say, don't stare at the back of somebody's head. So this, for a trained biologist like Sheldrake, says, hey, this seems to be occurring in the natural world. Let's go run a test and see if we find a correlation. So the correlation would be, if I stare at the back of your head for this given time under these controlled conditions, do you turn around? That's the correlation. And when you find that correlation, like Sheldrake did, it should change people's mind. People should go, wow, that's important. That's science. Now let's look for a causation. Let's look for a physics kind of explanation for what might be going on. But you don't deny the correlation, because the correlation is this really important part of this process. So similarly, if you will, now let me switch back over to astrology. So for astrology, the scientific question is there a correlation between the planets, sun, star, whatever, being in this particular position and then events happening in the physical world? If there is that correlation, then we would have to investigate further and figure out what the causation is, but we'd be down the track of saying that astrology has some realness to it. So, I was kind of getting on Neil deGrasse Tyson earlier, but it's over and over again. He seems to kind of miss that point because that question has been asked for a long time, and the results of it have been mixed. Sometimes people have found that correlation, sometimes they haven't. You don't get any sense of that from what he talks. That's because what he's really doing is just promoting a particular worldview, this status quo, keep everything going the way it is kind of worldview. And it's disguised in people like Joe Rogan, who is a super smart guy, but they don't just catch on to that part of the game and it just kind of slips past. But it's not going to slip past us today on Skeptical, hopefully. But back to my story, right? So I contact Jonathan, and Renay's work immediately has my interest. Because I investigate a little bit further, I look up, and Renay has published in the Journal for Scientific Exploration, which I know is a very good journal. I've had editors of the journal on this show. I've had people who have published in the journal on this show. And I know from talking to them that it's not only an excellent journal that's brave enough to tackle these controversial areas of science, but it's also a hard journal to get into. In fact, I know, referring back to Dr. Julie Beischel, she's told me that she's published in several academic journals and that the review process for JSE, Journal of Scientific Exploration, was by far the hardest review process that she went through. So it's a real deal. And when I saw that she had published there, my interest was piqued and I really wanted to go forward with the interview. But I still had in the back of my mind these questions, concerns about astrology being mostly bullshit. So I set up the interview with Renay, and at the same time, I said, why don't we do a reading? Because let's be clear, Renay isn't just an astrology researcher, she's also a practicing astrologer. So she provides that service, people pay her for that service, I paid her for that service, with the understanding that I would use it in the show as part of this exploration of astrology and astrology research. So we got everything set up, and then we went ahead and did the reading. And the reading was not very good. Not very good at all. And some of the things that really concerned me about the reading was not only was it not accurate, but Renay seemed really uncomfortable with the fact that the reading wasn't kind of working out. I wasn't. I was like, hey, I get that these things aren't perfect and that they don't always work. And there was this question about the time of my birth and whether I had that right, which I didn't. And I later confirmed by getting a copy of my birth certificate. But the whole reading was making me question the idea that you can really give somebody the time and place of your birth and they can start telling you all these precise things about your life and what's going to happen in the next 90 days or a couple of years or any of that stuff. So I was in this space. I wasn't put off by Renay's reading, and I was ready to move on and do the next interview we had scheduled to really talk about her research. But the email exchange we had after that reading changed everything. So Renay freaked out. She goes, oh my God, that was such a terrible reading. Please don't publish it. I don't want to do any more interviews. I should have never done this. I'm out of here. So I was surprised. I was really surprised. Because again, during the reading, I said, hey, this is no big deal. I've had medium readings from really good mediums that didn't go well, and yet I still believe there's after-death communication, and I believe there's people who can facilitate that, so this doesn't matter all that much to me. Let's talk about the research. But Renay was in freak-out mode. And the more I talked to her through email, the more pissed off I was getting. Pissed off because if you got the goods, if you've done the research, you ought to be able to suffer the slings and arrows that come with being on cutting-edge science. Now, as I say that, there's another side of me that wants to highlight how frickin' difficult this crazy biological robot scientific materialism stupidity makes it for people to endure, to persevere, to push their research forward when it goes against this kind of dogma. And I suspect that's what was going on with Renay. But still, I don't cut her any slack. Hey, if we're going to push this edge, we got to expect the pushback and we got to push through it. So I went back to Jonathan, the guy who originally turned me on to Renay. And we had a long talk and I told him exactly what happened. And I told him the same thing I told Renay. Hey, I'm going ahead with the show. And if you want me to do the show with just your crappy reading, then I'll do that. If you want to come on and explain yourself and stand up for your research, then maybe we'll have a different show. Now, fortunately, Renay came around, and I think we had a darn good interview about what I think is some incredibly important research concerning astrology. There is no doubt she's super smart, super capable. She's using AI, big data, very sophisticated statistical techniques, very solid science to bring forward a new picture about what's going on here, one that you'll never hear Neil deGrasse Tyson talk about because he's a boob. Anyways, if you really just want to, as Jonathan said in that opening email, discover knowledge once thought undiscoverable, here you go. Oh, one more thing. As you're listening to this interview, it starts, again, in kind of an unconventional way because it's not the first time in my conversation with Renay getting on Renay for backing out of this initial interview. And I think I pushed her pretty hard, but to her credit, she withstood it. And then we eventually got into the interview that we both wanted to have. Here's my interview with Renay Oshop. You published in JSC. You must have taken a lot of criticism because that's part of the process. But maybe you didn't. Maybe you slid the whole thing past them. Maybe they never asked really hard questions. They were just bamboozled by the data. I don't know. But I tell you what, I didn't have those questions going in. Like I say, I was totally on board because I've interviewed several people that have published in the JSC, and they've always told me, hey, it's really hard. You know, the reviewers are really tough and this and that. So, again, I had that assumption. But no, Renay, I don't have that same assumption about your work. So now that's where I'm at. Anyone who listens to the interview is going to know that the reading wasn't good. But who cares? It's just one individual reading. What I'm trying to figure out is this research worth anything is the second part of that. And when the researcher can't stand behind their research, well then, you know, that just raises a lot of red flags. What I expressed to you was, you know, my bias based on my experience was everyone thinks they're 95%. You know, all the psychics think they're 95%. All the mediums think they're 95%. And you're telling me you think you're 95%. Well, you know what? You're not 95%. And no one's 95%. But that doesn't take away from the fact that it might be real. So here's the question. The real question in my mind through the whole thing is, I have no doubt that astrology works. But does it work in the same way that tarot works? Does it work in the same way that reading coffee grinds work? In that the individual person is connecting to extended consciousness realms, which we don't really understand what they are, but we'll just put that name on it. Is that's what's happening? Is astrology a means for the person who's doing the individual reading to connect with this extended consciousness and bring forth information? Is that what's happening? Or is there some real physical, materialistic, really, connection between the layout of these planets and these stars and what's going on? I don't want to misrepresent the show one way or another. I'm not an advocate for astrology, but I'm not here to debunk astrology and your research in ways that it shouldn't be. But tell me why someone who's skeptical of your research should have confidence in it. So let me interject something here. So we're having this conversation, Renay and I'm telling her some of the problems I had with the way she handled things, and I'm very, very skeptical of her research, but I'm trying to figure out whether we should go ahead with the show. And I'm being pretty hard on her, but then at some point, we switch over and we start talking about her research. So let me just give you, we talk about it in length in this interview, what the research is, but it might be helpful here to kind of understand, big picture, what we're talking about. Two pieces of research that Renay did that are really fascinating. One is she looked at Twitter followers. She took this idea that there is this planetary alignment that would suggest that some people are more likely to be famous, followed, celebrity types than other people, right? So that's something you could test, see if there's a correlation, and that's what she did. The other thing that she did, which is really interesting, she said there's this Mercury retrograde thing that's been around for a long time. People have talked about that, hey, people kind of go nuts and can't do mental functioning the way that they normally do when this thing happens. And she did some research on that, trying to correlate it with common spelling errors in this huge database of Amazon comments. Again, a very clever bit of research that you'll hear a lot about, but I want you to at least have big picture view of these two pieces of research that we talk about as this goes on. Okay, back to the interview. Here it goes.
Well, again, I want people to tear it apart with a fine-tooth comb. That is what happened at JSC. I did rewrite it 3 times, and it was an awesome experience. I learned a lot from it, and I appreciate the JSC the more for that experience.
Here would be some potential criticisms that you're likely to hear. So I spoke with one person that I feel very confident in the research, and I feel very confident in the process that they've gone through with JSE, again, the Journal for Scientific Exploration that I keep saying I have this high regard for. And he pointed out a couple of things. He said, number one, there's no huge red flags in the research as it stands. He goes, if you want to talk to the JSE editors, number one, they're not going to talk to you. They've done their thing, and they're not going to come and kind of answer those kind of questions. But number two, if they did answer those questions, what they'd say is, based on the data that we have from her and her representation of it, yes, that's what we analyze. We can't analyze whether or not she really did it exactly the way that she said she did it, and that's where replication would come in. So do you agree with that? And number two, what about this issue of replication? What about someone who says, okay, that's all well and good what she's written there, but without replication, we don't really know if it's real?
I would worship the feet of anyone who would want to take that project on. I would love it if it were attempted. Replication, I hope it would come back the same as what I put out there, but it may not. That's the point of replication. I want replication. I would love replication. Please replicate me. Anyone out there listening?
How would someone go about replicating your work?
Oh, it's in the methods and materials, my approach. It's all laid out there. I have available all of my data in the form of screenshots because I took the data from Twitter at a particular snapshot in time. So they could totally just follow the steps A through Z in the methods and materials of the Twitter paper, for example. Or really, I release the data sets and I release the methods and materials.
Okay, this isn't a red flag per se, but the other thing that my friend said is, one thing that kind of just doesn't totally sit right is I don't see any missteps here. I see just kind of a lockstep, this is just what we set out to do and we did it and it all came out great. And he said, in my experience, research never works that way. What do you respond to that?
Are we talking particularly about the Twitter paper? Or
I suppose because that's in JSE, but I'd also like to talk more broadly about the Amazon misspelling one because that's interesting as well.
Yeah. Two totally different divergent experiences. With Twitter in the JSE, that was remarkably lockstep. It was where we were studying in class a particular ancient role in astrology, and my teacher looked at me and said, "Hey, we should test this with Twitter. Can you do that?" And I was like, "Yeah." And so we did it, and it was fairly lockstep. Now, Mercury retrograde, as you can see in the material I've put up on my website regarding it, and it has not been published yet. It has only been released in steps.
When you say Mercury retrograde, are you talking about the Amazon?
Yeah.
So briefly summarize what that experiment is, and then please continue.
Sure. Fundamental question. Hey, if there's this thing called Mercury retrograde, we should be able to see it in things like increased tech support calls during Mercury retrograde because people are having more problems, more mistakes, more misunderstandings, things associated with Mercury retrograde. Well, how do we measure such things without access to, for example, Verizon's tech support call records? So how can we get public data on mistakes? What does that even mean? And then I happened just during that time come across Stanford's public repository of big data sets, fascinating place to go explore. And I think it's just called that. You can just Google that. And Stanford repository of big data, something like that. And anyway, they had all of the Amazon reviews from the inception of the review system in 1996 to mid-2014. That's 20 years? 18 years, and so on. That's a lot of data in contemporary terms. So what's in there in terms of mistakes? Now, I would say, just on the face of it, there's no record in the data set, for example, of fixing misspellings. What we do see is a dampening, if you go into the data, of a downward curve of spelling mistake rates. That might be consistent with better spelling mistake catchers, the software that catches your spelling mistakes. Anyway, sorry. So there, you can see I went through tons, maybe 20 iterations of that.
Renay, let me interject because you were kind of on the line of kind of explaining it at a high level, and then you kind of got sidetracked into. I understand that's an interesting little aspect of it. So, but back to the big picture story.
Right.
So you get this big data set and your idea is, hey, here is actually a log of mistakes that is measurable if I can somehow do this massive spell check on that and see if there's more spelling errors on these certain dates. And then if I can go ahead and not only do that looking back in kind of a data mining way that people don't like, but then if I can also predict that going forward and saying, okay, I've looked at this much of the data and yeah, that pattern seems to exist. Now, without looking forward, let me predict what days are going to be more prone to spelling errors and let me see if that plays out. Am I getting this right? And then...
Yeah, I think that's well said. That's right. And I went through tons of mistakes on that one. Maybe because I was doing it on my own and I wasn't coming from any great astrological principle from 1,000 years ago. I just was going into the data and saying, show me data. Is there a periodic, regular, cyclic increase during Mercury retrograde? and using kind of classical Fourier transform, I found out, oh my gosh, there is this regular periodic increase during Mercury retrograde, up to 17%, not always 17%, but there is this regular periodicity. Then I used linear regression model to find the exact coefficients of when is it 17% per word increase in misspelling rate during Mercury retrograde, and when is there still a Mercury retrograde increase, but maybe at 5% per word likelihood increase. And using the linear regression model with the AI, I found that a model that works really well is one that employs all the planets' retrogressions, and there's a beautiful interaction there. Now, Mercury retrograde just being one of them. But I believe when there's retrogressions in Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto, and also retrogression in Mercury, that's when it's at its highest. But when there's only one of those, it's less than that.
How do you get at the old causation versus correlation thing? So, the big complaint that everyone has immediately when they look at astrology is that you're data mining, right? So every year, one of these skeptical organizations presents this, here is the zodiac sign that is the worst driver, right? And one year it's Capricorn, and the next year it's Sagittarius. And what they're just doing is taking the huge database of claims that have made against their insurance for accidents, and then they're data mining, looking through that and saying which one fell into this group, and they're reporting that as if that means anything, and then they're coming back and saying, see, this is what people do. They just data mine, and then they report it as there's some kind of causation rather than there's just some correlation, which there always is in the data. You totally get what I'm saying, but I just want to lay that out there for other people to understand. How do you respond to someone who says, how do we know you're not just doing the same thing?
Yeah, we might be talking about something that is happening at the same time as Mercury retrograde each year, for 18 years.
But hold on, that's not really my point. I mean, I'm giving you a lob question there, which is, and the answer is because that's what my fucking research shows. Is that's why you did all these fancy statistical analysis, is because you kept running it over and over and over again with different dates over time, and it wouldn't repeat. If the skeptics ran that, and they ran it for 20 years, and every year the same astrological sign came up and saying, yeah, Sagittarius worst drivers, Sagittarius worst drivers, well, then they would have something. But what they're making a joke of is when one year it's Sagittarius, and the next year it's Capricorn, and the next year it's Gemini, well, then that shows that there really is no pattern and there's no meaning to it.
Yeah, right. That's right. That this is something that's sustained. By definition, I was looking for something that was sustained through the entirety of 18 years, and that happened during Mercury retrograde. And I just want to point out that you brought up causation, and I'm not speaking to causation in my research at this point. I would love to get there, but at this point, we are talking about the first step, causation studies, as I understand it, and that is correlation.
Right. And I think that term, we should add that term is just misused and misunderstood by people, right? It's become such a trite axiom that people lose sight of it. It's like exactly what you said. A really good correlation that's carefully done is definitely a pointer towards causation. So what Axiom was supposed to point out is that a poor correlation, like I was just saying about the fact that you can data mine out with 1 year's of data, which astrological sign is the worst driver, well, that's really a very poor correlation, right? So maybe you can expound on that.
Yeah, there's going to be some sign that is the worst driver for a year or a month or a day. And even for a decade, there's going to be someone at the peak, at the top of that histogram, of sun signs and driving accidents. yeah, this whole idea of causation is huge. I mean, even in medicine, it's a huge thing to show that something causes something else. But yeah, the first step is to show a correlation. And we showed that in the Twitter paper pretty well. Subsequently, in the Mercury retrograde, we showed it too, and then also showed an AI prediction engine can be built from it that's really accurate using standard measures of AI.
One thing we might want to do, just for sake, we kind of glossed over the Twitter thing. Maybe you just want to explain at a high level what the Twitter experiment set out to do.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, there's this sutra in Sanskrit from a book from 1,000 years ago, well understood to be a 1,000-year-old text, that says that when these particular planets are in squares to each other at 90 degrees to each other, that the person is more likely to be famous, that you can interpret their chart as being that of a famous person.
Okay, so again, breaking it down to kind of a 6-year-old kind of thing, your astrological chart is based on the position of the planets and the stars when you take your first breath. There's this Vedic astrology that's been around for a long time, and it has all these axioms and ideas about what to do. And you say one interpretation is, hey, when these two things are at this particular position, that means the person's going to be famous, right? So go ahead, continue with the story.
Yeah, thanks. More exactly, in the exact words of the Sanskrit, that the person has a lot of followers. And so we were just chewing on that idea of followers, and we're like, well, what does it mean nowadays to have a lot of followers? Well, Twitter is a numerically accessible way to find out how many followers a person has. And it's different from fame, more exactly. Like Leonardo DiCaprio has a lot of fame, but not a lot of followers. Why is that? Why do some people who are not really anything else than a Twitter celebrity have a lot of followers, but not a lot of fame? So it's an interesting thing, and you can tell that in Leonardo DiCaprio's chart, if I recall correctly, he does not have this signature, this astrological signature for high followers, but he does have it for fame.
Now you got to realize there, I mean, that's kind of problematic, because what a lot of people would suggest is that one social media platform is not indicative of the number of followers. I would think that Leonardo DiCaprio has a lot of followers in the general sense. So I think that actually doesn't really fit with your research, because I think your research methodology is good, but I don't think it fits with that part. So tell folks what you did in terms of defining your followers group versus your non-followers group, and then how you did your analysis.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that was a fascinating process where we decided to just, in a moment in time, grab, screenshot all of top 1,000 people who have Twitter follower numbers. People like Justin Bieber had the most Twitter followers. Oprah Winfrey was in there. Dalai Lama was in there, and really all of them. And we chose 1,000 because that was the only number available, was the top 1,000. So we screenshotted that in a moment in time, and then fed in that data into a spreadsheet, and then looked for the charts. Went online and looked for charts of the Dalai Lama, Oprah Winfrey, Justin Bieber.
So I don't know, on some of them, were you able to get more information, like birth time and birthplace, and did you factor that in when you could? And when you didn't, did you just leave it out? I mean, how did you do that?
Yeah, exactly. So CNN, for example, it has a high number of Twitter followers, but there's no birth chart for that. So all the businesses were tossed out. All the people we could not find accurate birth times for, we tossed out. Now, how do we know it's accurate? There's actually astrological research sites that have reputations behind them, such as Astro Databank. And so we used Astro Databank a lot, and they're very good at recording how they know the birth information. So we only use those Twitter accounts whose owners we had very good astronomical birth data for.
Do you have any reason to believe that that would have skewed the data in one way or another?
Yeah, for example, there's a lot of Saudi Arabian princes or something, royalty who were in that top 1,000 for whom we do not have good birth data or any birth data. So they had to be tossed out. So absolutely there's a geographic skewing. There's even a time skewing, like for instance, so these were mostly American celebrities or some European celebrities for whom we could get the birth data. Now, check this out. The way we got a comparison group to compare whether this incidence of this ancient 1,000-year-old idea of what should be seen in a chart to show a lot of followers, to show whether there's a high incidence of this combination in the celebrity group, only 86 people. How do we show that? Well, we developed a Monte Carlo bootstrapped comparison group. Another Efron, from 1979 in his Stanford PhD paper, developed this really cool system where you can build comparison groups. You can build a comparison group from something called a Monte Carlo bootstrapped system, which is where it's okay that these are mostly European and American celebrities, that we're not including the Arabic group, for example. It's not bad because the comparison group is that same distribution of places, time.
So if I understand this correctly, the only way you can really get the astrological data that you need to test out this sutra and this positioning of the planets is you have to go to this website. What was the name of the website again?
Astro Data Bank.
Which you found to be reliable in terms of getting this. So anyways, you take your 1,000 off of Twitter, you pare it down in the way that you did, and you wind up with 86. And you say, okay, we have these 86. Now we want to compare that with, probably not the correct term, but basically your control group. And then you say, okay, so since our Astro database is where we're getting the data, we want to get the same data from that. How do we start selecting people out and not bias our selection where we're just hand picking out ones that'll kind of give us the result we have? And then you say you look to this guy who did this Stanford PhD, and he said, yeah, there's a way to do it using this Monte Carlo, this randomization kind of thing, where you can kind of get a good data set for your control group. So now you do that, and you have so how many do you wind up with in your control group? And was I right that you have 86? And then what do you do from there?
Yeah, and the control group, I believe, is 5,460. You can find that exact number in the paper. And what we did was just generate these theoretical charts, which were constructed from randomizations, as you say, of the birth times, places, and dates of the celebrity group. So we mixed them all up, constructed these 5,400 or so comparison group charts. And these are sort of theoretical people that we can compare the celebrities to. And the point there is that we can say, hey, there's not a skewing because the celebrity group tend to come from the LA area, the Los Angeles area. Maybe there's something special about the Los Angeles area. Well, that's in the comparison group. Maybe there's something special in the planets from 1964. Well, hey, that would be in the constructed comparison group as well. So this is a very nice technique, this bootstrap technique, to reduce all of those concerns that there's something anomalous in 1964 or in Los Angeles or in 8 a.m. or whatever kind of special qualities are in that small celebrity group. We can recreate those in the comparison group. So I thought it was a really appropriate and helpful approach to constructing that comparison group.
That's excellent. I think people will be very interested, skeptical listeners especially, will be very interested in those kind of little nitty-gritty details. So hence, that's where you get this bootstrap thing. So you can throw this data set at it and say, give me a random data set that kind of controls for these variables that might be skewed in my data set that I want to look at, and make sure that it's equally representative of the larger group, and it does that. Very cool. And then, so what are the results that you get out of that?
Sure. Well, we looked for incidents of this astrological arrangement from 1,000 years ago. Is it higher in the celebrities, the Twitter celebrities, than in this huge general populace?
What was the astronomical relationship again, in a way that people would kind of understand it?
Sure. It is that the planet with the highest degree, like you pull up an astrology chart, which is really a birth astronomy chart, and you look at the degrees. There's going to be little degrees next to each of the planets that describes how many degrees in 30 degrees that planet has passed through to get into that sign, really, that constellation. So even an astronomer will say that, say, moon is at 20 degrees Pisces right now. And sure enough, it's just an astronomical observation how many degrees a planet is in a constellation. So the planet with the highest number of degrees and the planet with the fifth highest number of degrees should be at 90 degrees to each other.
That's what the sutra predicts.
Yeah.
And as you just explained, that is a very measurable fact. There really isn't going to be, like you said, you could put an astronomer and say, go up on your telescope, and without that person believing in astrology, they could tell you whether or not that relationship between those two planets and their movement exists or doesn't exist, right?
Absolutely. Completely calculable, completely hands-off, no interpretation in any of the Twitter study. None. Just applying that sutra, looking for that sutra. And we found absolutely its incidence, I believe, is 76 out of 86 in the celebrity group. And in the huge comparison group, 5,400 charts, the mean was in the 40s, like 46 or something like that, 45, 44, something like that. And moreover, the standard deviation was, 7 or something. And so, in the normal curve that is generated from that standard deviation and that mean, you find that the p-value of getting the celebrity chart incidence is like 0.001 or something. The chance of getting the celebrity incidence given the distribution as found in the general population model of the comparison group is very low. So that was step one, to show that there is indeed a higher incidence, a statistic that we can say with statistical confidence that there's a higher incidence in the celebrity group of this ancient signature than in the general population.
So the chance of the celebrities having that alignment of those planets is over 90%. Over 90% of them are in that range. And then of the control group, or just not control group, but the random group, it's 45%. And then you ran all these trials, and when you run that through statistical analysis, the odds of that just being chance, that you just, the null hypothesis that it just, hey, it just happened that way, is far less than 1 out of 100, right?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good summary. So that was step one. And then step two in that paper was to show a correlation. So it's one thing to show a high incidence. That's actually kind of neat in itself, but it's not yet a correlation, where what we would want to see in step two is that as the follower numbers for a Twitter account increases, the likelihood of having this incidence increases too. So there's a positive correlation that as follower numbers increase, the likelihood of the holder of that Twitter account having this astronomical configuration at birth increases as well.
Why is that important?
Well, we talked earlier about the Mercury retrograde study and how important it is to show correlation as a first step for causation studies. Or just it's important to show correlation. There's, that's even out there in general science, that's the first thing people do is show a correlation.
I get that, and we can take this off if it's distracting, but I kind of don't get that part of it. I mean, the correlation you showed in that first part in terms of someone rising in the ranks, I mean, they can rise as much as they want. Their chart is either going to be there or not be there. So whether or not they rise to a level of come onto your radar doesn't seem to be significant in what you're measuring in terms of the correlation. So there's a lot of people out there that, like you said, there's 45% of people in your control group have that. They might be rising stars on Twitter in the future, who knows? But
isn't that fascinating? They might not be, though. And the reason why might be because of the chart. The highest, that very highest tail, as it's called, of the correlation is, people like Oprah Winfrey, people like Justin Bieber, people at the very tippity toppest of the pyramid there of how many followers you have in your Twitter account. In that top tail of the correlation, they all have this ancient signature.
So if I understand correctly, then I misunderstood, and I apologize. What I hear you saying now is that then you kind of reanalyzed your 86 celebrities, and you said, okay, now is there a correlation in terms of their total number of followers? And again, you're saying the high tip of the followers, are they more even strongly correlated? I didn't think that'd be that significant since you're already above 90%. I don't know how far you could go, but you're saying, yeah, even the top ones, it's 100%, and then there is a correlation where it tails down on the number of followers, right? Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly right. Yes, and that was step 2, and important in its own right to not just show high incidence in the general celebrity group. Yay, that's pretty cool, but let's go further. As follower numbers go up, so too does this incidence. So that people at the bottom of the top 1,000 Twitter followers only have this incidence 56% of the time. Now you go up into the top 500 Twitter followers, they have it at 70%. You go to the very top 100 people with the highest Twitter followers, they have it 100% of the time.
So of your list of 86, again, that started with 1,000 and you pared it down to 86 because some of the people being followed are CNN or InfoWars or something like that you can't even there's no person associated, there's no astrological data associated with it. So then you pare that down and you wind up with 86. And then, so of those 86, though, those are spread across that 1,000 rankings. So you might have somebody, even though it's 86, they might be down in the 1,000 range, like you just said. And then the real stunner, what you said is any one of that 86 who happen to rank in the top 100, 100% correlation between that and having this certain position of the planet kind of thing.
That's absolutely right. That's what we found.
That is pretty incredible. So how many does that represent?
I think it's 12 of the 86 in the top 100.
Yeah, that's significant.
So check out our paper and see what you think, and please give it a shot. Replicate it right now and see if it still holds, or if that was a one-off. And just on that particular day, at that particular hour, when we took that snapshot of the top 1,000, the final kind of criticism might be that, okay, that happened, but it was something in that snapshot alone. So let's take a few more snapshots. And like I said, every step is in the methods and materials. It's not too hard computationally. And I'd love to give any support to anyone out there, if I can, to replicate it. I'm all for replication efforts. I think that would be the next thing here with the Twitter paper.
No fair-minded person could ask for anything more than that, Renay. Excellent. You've acquitted yourself very well, and I'm glad we had this follow-on conversation.
Very glad to talk with you. Like I said, it's an honor to be on your show. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks again to Renay Oshop for joining me today on Skeptiko. There's really only one question to tee up from this interview. Do you think there is a correlation between certain planetary alignments and physical things that happen down here on Earth? Do you think Renay's research moves us towards coming to that conclusion based on the statistical analysis of her data? So let me hear your thoughts. Of course, the place to do it is through the Skeptical Forum or at skeptiko.com, skeptiko.com. And there you can download, of course, all the 350 previous shows and subscribe to the newsletter and do some other cool stuff, all the usual podcasting stuff. So please do that. Please share the show. Tell your friends about the show. And please stay tuned because I have some more great episodes coming up. That's it for this time. Take care. Bye for now.